Hello, and welcome to Senior Moments. I'm Dolly Simonovich. More and more people have been using natural sweeteners like agave syrup, rice syrup, and stevia. Honey, though, is one of the best sweeteners around. It's natural, it's good for you, it tastes good, and it even has antibiotic and antiseptic properties. No wonder it's all the rage now to have honeybees in one's own backyard. It has become so popular, in fact, that I hear you can buy a beekeeping starter kit at Costco. What does it take to become a beekeeper? We met with Kendall Sager, a local beekeeper, to find out who would want to do it and why.
I got started with beekeeping by a friend of mine in college. He got bees and he needed a hand one day, and I thought, sure, why not? And I went out back with him, and I didn't even have a suit on, but he opened up the hives, and the bees were so much calmer than I expected. They just kept doing whatever it was they do. I saw the baby bees, larvae, pupae, and how they were storing nectar and pollen, and it was just fascinating, and I think I was kind of hooked from that point. When I'm managing my bees, mostly what I'm looking for is just making sure they have enough space to bring in nectar, or not too much space so that pests move in. And as a natural beekeeper, that's all I'm really doing, is just managing space. So I've got my bee suit, I suit up, go outside, I give them a little bit of smoke, and I'll go in and inspect kind of the health of the colony, make sure my queen is okay, she's laying eggs, there are lots of bees there, see if they need more space, and throughout the season I can harvest honey. So those are kind of my main points as a beekeeper. I think the reason why I keep bees is probably pretty different than most other people. I think some of the most obvious reasons are honey or pollination, but I really got into it for education. I've always had a passion for education, and right now I teach classes for all ages, from how honey is made to how to keep bees in your own backyard. And so the bees were really, I wanted them so that I could have classes like this. And the ultimate goal would be to have a learning farm, so have more animals, and bees are really just my first farm animal. Well, I usually have about 5 hives in my own backyard, and I have one beehive up in Petaluma in the North Bay, on top of a brewery, actually, so they can have local honey. So that's a total of 6 hives. And the number will go up and down throughout the season. So right now I have 2 additional hives, right now the little tiny hives, and I'll be giving those away or selling them. Bees are really important for pretty much like all of our food intake. So 1 out of 3 bites of produce that you're eating was probably pollinated by a bee. And while bees are not the only available pollinator, there are a lot of wild bee species, flies, butterflies, birds that pollinate. Bees are the most commercially available pollinator in that they come in these very convenient boxes that we can seal up and transport around the country. So the almond orchards in the middle of California, bees will be trucked from as far away as Maine to pollinate those almonds. And it takes about 2/3 of the honeybee colonies in the United States to pollinate the almond orchards. So that's maybe about 1.5 million bee colonies. One of the common myths about beekeeping is that they're very aggressive in this swarming behavior. There's just bees everywhere. Swarming is actually a really natural part of the bee's life cycle. In the springtime is usually when you'll see a swarm. And this is when half of the honeybees leave with the queen, and it's how they propagate. So they'll start a new beehive somewhere else. And they usually ball up. They'll stay in one spot for an hour, 2 hours while scouts go out and look for a suitable location for a new hive. They're actually some of the most docile bees because they have no babies to protect. They have no food stores to protect. They've just got the queen with them. So many beekeepers find them to be pretty docile. Of course, you don't want to approach one of these things on your own, but they're not out to get you. It's just they're propagating as they usually would. The bees that remain in the hive, they're raising a new queen, so that's how it splits in half. Bees don't want to sting you because when they sting you, they die. And when most people think of being stung, you're thinking of being stung by any stinging insect. So you're kind of lumping wasps into the same category as honeybees. So honeybees are going back and forth and collecting nectar and pollen from flowers, and they're storing that or making it into honey. Wasps, they're carnivorous, and they'll go and eat honeybees. So you'll see wasps sometimes in the front of beehives picking off dead or weak bees. And they're the ones that you typically see at your picnic if they're hanging around your hamburgers. And they will sting multiple times. They don't die during stinging. The honeybees are vegetarians. They're very calm for the most part. We're sitting maybe 15 feet away from the front of my hives, and no one's bothering us. They really just go back and forth to collect pollen and nectar, and they're just going back to their hive. So when you typically get stung, it's because maybe you've stepped on a bee and they don't like being stepped on, or you've kind of squished them, or if you start swatting at them, they become alarmed and they'll sting. As a beekeeper, I might get stung if I'm opening up their hive because I'm opening up to where their babies are. So they're becoming defensive of their babies. And the first thing they do isn't come out and sting me. They'll actually give me several warnings, much like any other pet that you have. If your cat has its ears back and is hissing at you, I'm not gonna go and pet it. Same thing with the bees. The first thing they typically do is they'll bounce off of my veil. So I have a veil for beekeeping, and they'll tap me near my face, which they can tell where my face is because I'm breathing. And this is to say that I'm in their territory and they'd prefer not to sting me, they'd like me to leave. And typically when they start doing that, because I'm a smaller scale beekeeper, I typically close them up and walk away, and I avoid stings. The next thing they do is if I haven't left, they'll go back, alert the entire colony, and you can actually hear the volume rise in the hive. So there's this nice calm, happy buzz right now, so it'll go from zzz to zzz, and then everyone's on alert. And the next step from that is stings. So they've given me a lot of warnings, a lot of leeway to get out of their way, and the last step is they're really trying to protect their hive and their babies, so they'll sting me. So some of the natural enemies for bees that we might think of, there are wasps, which usually in the fall time there's a very high wasp population and they eat bees. Birds, I have a blue jay that kind of sits on the bench here and just watches the bees go back and forth until he sees an especially fat one to pick off. Some of the other backyard animals that I deal with, I've got my bees up on a stand about 18 inches above the ground because under my deck live skunks. And skunks can eat an entire beehive in just a few nights. So they'll sit at the front of the hive and scratch, and the bees will come out to defend, and the skunk is basically just sitting at the entrance going and just eating the entire hive. So they love to eat insects. So putting them up on the stand saves them from the skunks. I also have some pretty heavy covers on top of my hives in case raccoons want to get in there, because sometimes, especially if the hive is a little more empty, the honey is a little less guarded. Raccoons love that. And a lot of people, I think you think of a honey bear, like Pooh Bear going into the hive. Bears are a natural enemy, but not so in California. We don't live in bear country right here, but if you were out in Montana, you would definitely need fencing around your bees to protect them from bears. Some of the smaller pests that you might not think about, which is actually one of the major contributors to honeybee decline, is the varroa mite. So these mites are very, very tiny, and they'll breed in the same little cells as the bees, and they're really a vector for diseases. So rather than the mite preying on the bees, they carry all of these diseases that slowly kill off the bees. Colony collapse disorder is when the bees just disappear. So it doesn't look like anything in particular killed them. There aren't a bunch of dead bodies. It's almost like they get lost. So you'll see a hive that only has a few worker bees left and the queen. So it's very desolate, definitely not enough bees to make it through the winter or live for any sustained amount of time. So I haven't seen that a whole lot in rural areas, but major commercial beekeepers are seeing this in large numbers, and we're seeing this throughout the world. So this has been happening in Europe for quite a long time, and it's been happening here for quite a long time. And there's no consensus on what might be causing this, because there may be very many contributors to this. So some of the contributors might be systemic pesticides, which are expressed in pollen and nectar, and the bees will eat that, bring it back to their hive, might be weakening their immune system. The variety of forage that they're exposed to. There are some studies where if there's a large variety of plants for bees to feed on, they're typically a lot healthier than bees who only feed on one type of food. So those bees that are being trucked around and only get kind of this pesticide-soaked agriculture, they might not be as healthy as a bee in a suburban environment that has tons to feed on. Trucking the bees around also might not be very good for them because they're not used to any one climate or environment. So I think as hobbyist beekeepers, you have bees that are breeding with local honeybees that are living wildly, that they're living in your backyard. You have maybe a better genetic stock than these beekeepers who have thousands and thousands of the same type of genetic stock or the same strain of bees. So if one virus comes along, wipes out a lot of commercial bees at once. So there's really a lot of reasons why bees might be hurting right now. There are over 20,000 different types of bees known to us around the world. Just in the Bay Area alone, I think there are at least 20 different species of bee. Bees actually live on every single continent except Antarctica. So bees can live in pretty much any climate, so they can hibernate through snowy climates. Here in the Bay Area, we have one of the best climates for honey production because we have things blooming year-round. I've got some rosemary hedges out front, and I see honeybees on that in December and January, when in other colder climates, they might actually be hibernating. So the warm climates, they like at least a little bit of moisture because they use water, so they'll collect dew in the mornings to control the temperature inside of the hive. So they actually use it much like humans use sweat. They use that as an evaporative cooling method for inside of the hive if it gets too hot on a sunny day. They also use it to control the consistency of honey. So they like a little bit of moisture, not desert. So it's a little tough for them right now in the drought with a lot less blooming. So they have a lot less to forage on, and they have a lot less kind of like drips to grab water from as well.
Don't go away, we're just getting started with our program on beekeeping. We'll be back in just a few minutes.
Severe weather can destroy a home in seconds. There's no time to think, only time to act. Have a kit so you're ready for any emergency. Develop a plan for what you and your family will do before disaster strikes, and stay informed during severe weather any way you can. It can be the difference between losing your possessions and losing your life. Just ask the owners of this house. Visit ready.gov for ways to prepare your family for emergencies.
Body language can tell you all sorts of things. Like someone is having a stroke. Know the sudden signs. Learn fast. Face drooping, arm weakness, speech difficulty. Time to call 911 and get them to a hospital immediately. Learn the body language and spot a stroke fast.
Why do you like San Bruno Cable?
When they come over to your home and they do something for you, it's done right the first time.
I went to the front office to change a box, and they were very helpful. They were very friendly, and they were really fast.
There's a lot of channels, a lot of good entertainment for my children.
I believe in doing business in the town that I live in.
Thank you for choosing San Bruno Cable.
Todd's a great guy. I mean, look at him. What a sweetheart. Attaboy. Wait, Todd, what are you doing? How totally selfish and un-Todd-like of you. Come on, Todd. Come on, man.
Welcome back to Senior Moments. Are you curious about keeping your own bees? Want to know what sort of time commitment is needed? Continue to watch our interview with Kendall Sager, who will talk about this, as well as the cost and where to get more information.
There's a beekeeping book out there by Kim Flodham that says bees are more work than your cat, but less work than your dog. I think maybe I take too good care of my cats because I think they're even less time than cats. In general, it's about 80 hours of work spaced throughout the year, mostly in the springtime and when you're harvesting honey. So in the winter, the bees are pretty self-sufficient. The temperature's too cool to go in there and inspect the hives. So November through January, you're not really doing much of anything with the bees. That's your time off. February through April is really high season for the bees. So I'll be inside the hives inspecting them maybe once a weekend. And the hive inspection might take up to an hour. So that's maybe 1 hour every weekend to just check that they have enough space to store all of the new nectar that's been blooming in the spring. In the summer, there's less blooming, so it's less of a frenzy for nectar. But maybe once a month I check on them. I check on them kind of just visually outside to see how they're doing. And then in the fall, it's definitely down to once a month inspections and just kind of reducing the space so they have a nice small area to go into winter and hibernate if they are going to hibernate. Here in California, it's typically not cool enough. So honey harvesting is the more labor intensive thing, and that usually takes me a weekend, and that's because I'm harvesting vast quantities of honey. So I'm usually harvesting at least 5 gallons of honey at a time. So that can be that's well over 100 pounds of honey. So, and that one, yeah, usually takes me a whole weekend. And I do that about 3 times a year. Splitting the hive is when, instead of naturally swarming in the spring and half the bees leave, I'm manually managing that process. So I take half the bees out and move them. And this is typically referred to as a walk-away split. Is I've divided the resources in half. I make sure that both halves have eggs, pollen, nectar, and they have nurse bees. So nurse bees are young bees who have just hatched, and they usually stay inside of the hive and care for young bees. So I want a lot of nurse bees to raise a new queen, to feed this queen very high nutrient value food, which is royal jelly. And this way, whichever hive ended up with the queen, they've got the queen, she'll continue laying eggs, and the hive that ended up without the queen, they have enough resources to raise a new queen. This way they don't leave on their own, and I'm just throwing bees out into the neighborhood. Typically we don't want that as beekeepers, just to be a good neighbor, to not have bees everywhere. I might also do it if I've lost some colonies over the winter. Right now, one of the statistics that's been released is we lose 40% of all bee colonies every single winter. So this doesn't mean that the overall bee population is dropping. It just means that I have to spend more energy splitting my hives and building up a new population. So typically we get less honey production if we're splitting our hives all the time. So to get started in beekeeping, you'll probably end up spending an average of $500, and that would include a few $100s for your equipment, so your woodenware, the boxes that the bees live in, another $100 or so for some basic tools. So you'll need like a little crowbar, it's only a few bucks, a smoker, maybe 20 bucks, and you'll need a beekeeping suit. And you can definitely adjust any of this. So I've got a full suit, which is more expensive than just a little veil, and you wear long sleeves and gloves when you use that instead. So there's some ways to adjust it to be less expensive. And bees, if you're buying bees, they're typically about $100 to just buy a box of bees to then dump into your beehive. So all of that, a total of $500. Annually, Every 5 years or so, you want to make sure you're replacing your wooden equipment. So that's not necessarily every year you'll realize it. So that's a few $100s spread over the course of 5 years. And you'll also probably be buying jars to jar your honey and maybe some additional honey equipment. And hey, it's a hobby, so you're probably, maybe you get into candle making or making lip balm or making mead or beer. So there's any number of add-ons, but I'd say at least you're probably spending another $100 a year just to get your glasses for honey and replacing your equipment. You actually don't need very much space to keep bees at all. I keep them in my own backyard. I have about 5 hives. The main thing you're looking at when you're looking at space for bees is you want to make sure that the human space and the bee space is separate. So my bees have either a house or a fence on either side, and that causes them to go up and away. And there's kind of like a little bench, and usually there are some bushes in front so the bees don't zip across the yard, and that keeps the yard where I have like a table and chairs and we eat dinner, that keeps them very separate from where the bees are living. So some fencing goes a long way. In apartment complexes or in San Francisco or my bees up in the North Bay, we keep them on top of a roof. So they're not taking up any footprint on the ground, but then I have to think about my roof access. So bees can be very heavy. So each box filled with honey can weigh about 50 pounds. So you don't want to be lugging that up a ladder. Ideally, you'd want some stairs or something like that. So you don't need very much space at all. And in the smallest spaces I've kept them in kind of a side yard that's about 6 feet wide. And I just manage them by putting bushes or a fencing to make sure they go up and away. And the bees will stay up and out of the way until they find a flower to forage on, and then they'll come down. So that kind of keeps them out of your space. Anyone can really keep bees, but you do want to check in with your city to make sure it's legal in your area. So throughout, I'm mostly familiar with San Mateo County and also with Los Altos and Santa Clara County. In Los Altos, there are no regulations on the number of beehives, and this is ideally, as a beekeeper, what we want, is we want the bees to fall under regular nuisance laws, and that would be if the bees are a problem or they're interfering with other people, then we'd have to do something about the bees. In general, they're not a nuisance, and especially if they're well cared for, if you're providing adequate forage, you don't have too many beehives in one location. So that's ideally what we want. Unfortunately, there are some beekeeping regulations throughout the state. And in San Mateo County, Foster City, beekeeping is currently completely illegal. You can't have any beehives. And the San Mateo Beekeepers Guild is actually working on lifting some of these regulations or changing them to be a little more friendly towards beekeeping right now. Some other regulations might be that you have to keep the hives a certain distance away from a household or from a property line, and for many suburban lots that might be a bit difficult. So just check in with your county. If you don't know, your Beekeepers Guild has beekeepers in all of the cities, so someone there will probably know too if you need a little hand navigating the government websites. There are tons of ways, if you don't want to have bees in your backyard, how you can help bees. One way you can help honeybees is by really being conscious of the types of pesticides you're bringing into your yard and using on your plants. If you can be all natural, that's really the best thing for honeybees. And if not, spraying pesticides on non-blooming plants, because bees are really only interested on plants that are blooming. So using on non-blooming plants will help them not be exposed to pesticides. And in particular, the types of pesticides you'd like to avoid is systemic pesticides. And there's a list on Xerxes.org, has an amazing list of pesticides because it's really hard to tell when you go to the gardening store. You'll see all-in-one rose care, and this contains systemic pesticides.
So it's actually absorbed by the plant material and expressed in the leaves so that aphids and things don't eat your roses, but it's also expressed in nectar and pollen. So you're exposing bees to a very low level of pesticides throughout the year. And this might be weakening their immune systems and making them more susceptible to viruses that are being carried by mites. So this is one of the suspected causes of colony collapse. Though there's no consensus, systemic pesticides might be playing a role in that.
You can plant for pollinators. So there's a lot of pollinator-friendly forage. You can find them at local nurseries. Many of them actually right now are putting labels that these are friendly for honeybees or pollinator-friendly, so they're good for wild bees, native bees, or hummingbirds. There are tons of lists online that you can find. Just to name a few, lavender is a great drought-tolerant, beautiful smelling, gorgeous plant, blooms very often. Bees love it. Rosemary, even trees, like I think there's a lot of native eucalyptus that the bees are into all of the time. And that's just to name a few flowers. And when you are laying out your garden, bees typically like to forage in patterns. So if you can plant in clusters, that really helps the bees out, and that'll make it more appealing to the bees, because a bee will go out and visit anywhere from 150 to 1,500 flowers on one outing to collect nectar, and she'll only collect nectar from one type of flower. So if she sees a big patch of lavender, she's more likely to go there because she knows she can fill up her nectar stomach and go home. And then she'll send more bees over there. Bees actually really love a lot of plants that we might not love quite as much. So if you see dandelions in your lawn, bees love dandelions. They love to forage on things like that, and very many weeds actually. So if you're using herbicides like Roundup, this could have a big effect on the bees. You want to do it before these plants bloom so that the bees are not interested in the plant. But even herbicides, even though it's not an insecticide, it can harm the bees. If you don't have planting space, or you can only plant a few plants, every little bit helps. And if you can't plant more things, or you've already planted, providing water is also very helpful. You want to make sure that you're not raising mosquitoes as well, so you want to change out your water often, or have moving water, like with a fountain. And if you're providing water for bees, I like to leave bee rafts in the water, so something like corks, sticks, little planks that they can stand on while they're drinking water, and then they'll bring that back to the hive. And especially in a drought like this, providing water is really great for the bees. There are bees in everybody's neighborhood, whether you know it or not. Especially in suburban areas up and down the peninsula like this, there is so much blooming that bees are pretty much everywhere, both native bees and honeybees. There are a lot of wild honeybee colonies all up and down the peninsula, in trees, in turned over pots, barrels, anything that's a good cavity. So unfortunately, maybe some houses in your roof, but there are bees all over the place. Some places where it's harder to have natural bees is actually in agricultural lands, because we have enormous monocultures. So we have acres and acres and acres of one type of plant. And while that's great while that plant is blooming for a few weeks, but when it stops blooming, there's nothing else to feed on. So this is really hard for any native bees or anything other than a commercial pollinator. So a commercial pollinator with European honeybees coming in, placing the bees, and then removing the bees when they're done. So you might not find bees in large agricultural zones right now, unless there is a variety of forage. So if there's multiple different crops within a half mile of each other, because bees will only forage up to 5 miles, and that's really on the high end. They'd really like to stay within a quarter mile of their hive.
I'm learning so much about beekeeping. If you want to learn more, stay tuned.
They're here. They're looking for you. They want to drink your blood. Help us stop invasive Aedes aegypti mosquitoes in your neighborhood. Dump or drain all standing water around your home. Remove containers, flower pots, and anything that can hold water. Go to smcmvcd.org or call the San Mateo County Mosquito and Vector Control District to report day-biting mosquitoes. San Mateo County Mosquito and Vector Control District, protecting public health since 1916. You know the old saying, the grass is always greener on the other side. Well, it may look that way, but when you get up close, it's all weeds and stickers. Those big company TV providers may have great introductory offers, but read the fine print. Do you have to sign a long-term contract? Do they offer free service calls? And just how high do their rates go after the limited time offer expires? At San Bruno Cable, you sign no long-term contract. Our rates are easy to understand without surprises, and if you experience a problem, we offer free service calls on the next business day. Thank you for choosing San Bruno Cable.
So, same time next week?
Well, of course. Put away a few bucks, feel like $1 million. For free tips to help you save, go to Feed the Pig.
Alvin and the Chipmunks want to remind you, bacteria can hide in food and make you ill.
Wow.
But you can keep bacteria from ruining your day with 4 simple steps. Clean.
I'm waiting for the rinse cycle.
Separate. Cook.
Fire in the hole!
And chill.
We chipmunks are notoriously tight.
Check your steps. The road trip to food safety starts at foodsafety.gov.
We are here in Senior Moments talking with Kendall Sager about beekeeping. Besides honey, bees produce an assortment of products. Here's Kendall to tell us more.
Bees produce honey because this is actually a food source for them. They'll eat honey as a source of energy and pollen as a source of protein. So really they're eating a mixture of these two things. And they store such quantities because in most environments they have a winter to hibernate through. So they want to have a lot of honey stores to make it through winter. Though bees, they're very, very busy, very good at what they do. The European honeybee, which is what most commercial honeybee keepers keep, they store hundreds of pounds of honey. Each year, I would typically get about 100 pounds from each hive. So that's a little over, I think, 7 gallons of honey each year from 5 hives. That's quite a lot of honey. And in the peninsula, you can harvest a lot of that. So they don't need very much to make it through their own winter because winter's very short. And for the past 2 winters, we've had 80-degree weather in January. So the bees are out foraging pretty much year-round. They will need some stores to make it through the winter, but not nearly 100 pounds of it. They might need 10 pounds. There's not really a season for honey. So you can harvest it pretty much year-round whenever it's there. I'm harvesting typically in the spring from March through September. They'll be bringing in honey, and I typically wait until there's a lot of honey to harvest because harvesting honey is a big sticky mess that kind of takes out my kitchen for the better part of a weekend, if not longer, if I'm not as good at cleaning. But so I try to minimize it to about 3 times a year. So in those 3 times a year, I'll be getting somewhere between 50 and 100 pounds of honey out of each hive. And that I use a centrifugal extractor. I'll spin the honey and it comes out of the honeycomb and drips down the sides. You filter out the larger wax bits, but then it just goes straight into the bottle. So it tastes a lot, you get a lot of local flavors. It's a lot of the local pollen and nectar. So when you're looking for honey to buy, you might want to see if it is local because local honey contains a lot of pollen from your area. Some people think that this helps with your allergies. I think it is, in general, much more delicious because it's less of a filtration process. So if you also look for raw honey, it's honey that's never been heated above the temperature of the hive. So it contains more natural enzymes that the bees have created, so you're getting more of a nutritional value from that. Honey that you find in the store, they're typically mixed with multiple hives because they want to have a consistent product, so you don't have a huge variety in what you're tasting. So here, my honey, last year I could taste when the blackberries were blooming. And that's just so cool, as opposed to honey in the store that might be a syrup, which you should also check that the only ingredient is honey. So in a lot of them, they might actually be watered down. There might be flavorings or sucrose in them. You only want honey in your honey. So if you find a wild beehive either in your home, on your property somewhere, in a tree, the first thing I would do is call my local beekeeping guild, because they're usually very well equipped to send someone out and catch honeybees for you. Beekeepers do love this because they'd like to take those honeybees and actually a few of my hives here are from swarms, so that we found around. You usually make them into a new hive because there's a queen already there, there's bees already there, so wherever the queen is, the bees will live. So one of the most fun parts of catching a swarm of bees is they'll all be sitting on maybe a branch, and there's just this ball of bees hanging there. And you can shake them. I usually shake them into a cardboard box, and you can tell when you've got the queen, because when you've got the queen in the box, the bees start just going into the box. It's kind of like the Pied Piper with bees. And once you've got them in the box, I'll transfer them into a honeybee hive. So typically a Langstroth hive, and I'll dump them in there. And as long as the queen's in there, all the bees will kind of go in, and that is their new home. If you call a local exterminator, oftentimes they're calling the Beekeeping Guild because they don't want to kill honeybees either. Honeybees are in some trouble right now. I think it's very much in the public view. So no one wants to go around killing honeybees. And in most cases, we try to save the honeybees. So as a beekeeper, this is great. Free bees. So I'm gonna go and collect those honeybees. Like, I've collected them from down the street or in our local neighborhood. And if it's a more professional job, there are professional beekeeping removal services that don't harm the honeybees. They'll cut them out and do their best to save them. Some of the hardest situations to save them is if they're in, say, an old tree that has a hollow in it. It's very hard to lure them out, but there are ways of doing that too. It just might take more time. So your bees might not be gone immediately, but you will still be able to get them out. One of the most common products that you see out of a honeybee hive is honey. They produce a lot of it, and I think most people are familiar with it. Some other things that you might not be thinking of are pollen. You can harvest pollen from honeybees as well. It usually comes in little balls that they've collected on their back legs in a collection of hairs called a pollen basket. And there's a special trap that knocks this off as they're walking into the hive. You can use this as an additive to yogurt. You can sprinkle it on yogurt, sprinkle it on cereal. It's the texture of powdered sugar, but it tastes like you're eating a flower. So it's very floral and lovely. There's also royal jelly, which is produced from a gland in the bee's head, actually. So this is not something they're collecting like nectar and turning it into honey. It's a high nutrient substance, and it's called royal jelly because the queen eats it her entire life, and this allows her to develop into the large queen bee that she is. The other bees eat pollen and nectar, which is more of a sustaining food, but not as nutrient rich as royal jelly. There's also beeswax. So bees will produce wax from flakes on their abdomen when they're very young bees, and they'll chew this up and build it into honeycomb. As a beekeeper, I get a lot of beeswax from when I harvest honey. I'll scrape open the honeycomb and then spin the honey out, but then I have this beautiful fresh wax that I can use to make candles. I personally make a lot of lip balm with it. It's also in some lotions or soaps. So there's a lot of beauty products that come from honey or beeswax. And then the last one, which is probably the least common, is propolis. So propolis is tree sap, And this is something that they're collecting, and they use it almost like a varnish or a seal within the hive. It's a natural antimicrobial, so they kind of coat the entire inside of the hive with it to try to keep mold and other like bacteria from growing on the hive walls. And as a human, we can use this in tinctures as kind of like an antimicrobial salve, or you can also use it for varnish. It's a beautiful, like in this area, it's a beautiful like reddish brown color. And historically, Stradivarius violins were varnished with propolis. So those are just some of the few products you get from bees. If you want to learn about beekeeping, I think one of the best resources you have available to you is your local Beekeepers Guild. If you just Google the name of your county and beekeeping, you'll probably come up with your beekeeping association. So you can kind of go to any of these clubs. They usually have monthly meetings. They have speakers, so experts in the field who will come and talk. And you have a resource of hundreds of local beekeepers who are in your area. So if you want a beehive, if you want a mentor, they can really set you up. I myself am a local beekeeper. My website is Kendall's Bees, and I have a blog following kind of the goings-on of my bees, as well as just in general what I'm up to that's bee related. So I've been posting a lot of great summer honey recipes right now. But those are, I think, some of the best resources is your local guild, meet the beekeepers at your local farmers markets and see what they're up to. If you want to take some local classes on beekeeping, there are a lot of local areas. One that's very local to me is Hidden Villa, which is down in Los Altos, and it's a big nonprofit open space preserve that has a learning farm. And I've been doing a lot of beekeeping classes with them. So I do some hive to table classes on harvesting your own honey. You walk home with your own honey. I also do a lot of children's classes that's called All About Bees, and we'll get to touch stuff from inside the hive, honeycomb, taste honey, and learn what the bees are doing throughout the year. So we have classes for all ages. It's a great place that's local to learn more about honeybees. There are also a lot of really great books. Honestly, my favorite that got me started was Beekeeping for Dummies. It's really well laid out, actually. It was written by a beekeeper who experiences winter, so as a California beekeeper, there's some sections in there that you don't have to worry about because it doesn't snow here. But those are some really great resources. There are also hands-on classes, which I can't recommend enough, and they're all over the Bay Area with local apiaries will offer beekeeping classes. So there's any number of ways, whatever works for you or your schedule, that you can get started.
Beekeeping is such a fascinating hobby. If this program has tickled your fancy, keep watching to the end. We will have contact information for the various websites Kendall mentioned. I do hope you enjoyed our program. I'm Dolly Simonovich for Senior Moments.